Hello, I'm Tania Branigan and I'll be delivering the last of the Darwin lectures this year. I'll be talking about the Cultural Revolution, the movement that tore China apart from 1966 to 1976, and I'll be talking about what happened, whether it was really a revolution, and how it continues to shape China to this day.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our 8th and final Darwin lecture series on the theme of revolution, to be given by Tania Branigan. Tania received her undergraduate degree here at King's College, Cambridge, before embarking upon a career in journalism, as I'm sure many of you know. She joined The Guardian, initially as a reporter and then political correspondent, but is now one of the foreign leader writers and has spent 7 years as The Guardian's China correspondent from 2008. As an ornithologist, however, I was delighted to discover that one of her more unusual achievements in Beijing was to launch something called the Azure-Winged Magpie Appreciation Society. Way back when I think you started there. At the time it had 2 members, which was far less than there were magpies, I suspect, in Beijing, and I hope there are now more of both. Tania published her first book, Red Memory, Living, Remembering and Forgetting China's Cultural Revolution, in 2023, and that is a remarkable exploration of the Cultural Revolution and how it has shaped the China that we all know and see today, and perhaps don't know entirely. So Red Memory has won her numerous awards, the Cunhill History Prize in Canada, which is a book prize for the best history writing in English. It was shortlisted for the British Academy Prize for Non-Fiction in 2023. It's a Sunday Times Book of the Year and a BBC Radio 4 Book of the Week. Her writing has appeared in many other places as well as The Guardian, including The Washington Post and The Australian. So please join me without further ado in giving Tania a very warm welcome to deliver her lecture on the Cultural Revolution. Tania.
Thank you. It's a great honour to be speaking here tonight, of course, but also, frankly, a little bit daunting to be following in such august footsteps. And perhaps, as a journalist amid academics, I should be feeling a little bit of imposter syndrome at the moment. But I have to confess that I'm actually rather pleased to be able to bask in the sort of lingering aura of academic respectability that's been shed by previous speakers. It goes without saying that while my primary sources in writing on the Cultural Revolution are the many survivors of that time, I couldn't have written Red Memory without the immense amount of in-depth research that's been done by academics and other researchers on everything from the finest nuances of the political machinations at the very top of the Communist Party, right through to how many Mao badges were produced in that era. And if you're interested, the answer was 5 billion, which was not only enough for everybody to carry several upon their jackets, but also used up so much aluminium that Mao himself reportedly complained, "Give me back my aeroplanes." But although I love reading history books, I had no intention of writing one when I moved to China. As a journalist, my job is to find out what's happening and what might come next, not to look back. And when I was in China as correspondent for The Guardian, that task was more than usually challenging. The kind of transformations that had taken centuries in the West were happening here in decades. At one stage, there were 4 new billionaires a month. The Beijing subway laid more new track in a decade than the London Underground had done in 150 years. There were new airports and theatres and shopping centres and museums everywhere you looked, and people were constantly changing jobs and taking up new passions and moving from place to place. It was exhilarating and also disorienting, often quite literally. At one stage, I went on a short reporting trip, and when I returned just a few days later, I thought the taxi driver had dropped me in the wrong place, because the wasteland that used to face my flat had vanished. And in its place, there was a park, complete with green lawns, planted flower beds, fully mature trees, and even a little pavilion where a group of pensioners was gathered around while one of them played the Ahu as if they'd sort of been meeting there for years. So it really was impossible to keep up with this world that was continually reinventing itself. And it seemed quixotic at best for both Chinese citizens and those reporting on them to look over their shoulders instead of scrabbling all the time to just keep up and get ahead. And yet, I had the uncanny sense that every story I was covering, whether it was cultural or economic or political or social, kept leading me back to the same place. And that even as China drove itself relentlessly forward, it was really being propelled by a force that lay behind it, mostly unseen. The Cultural Revolution. 10 years of violence, chaos, and stagnation that consumed China from the moment that Mao Zedong unleashed it in 1966 until after his death in 1976. A decade that scars and shapes it to this day. It was an era in which 2 million people were killed or driven to their deaths, and tens of millions were hounded. They were guilty of thought crimes, or belonging to a landlord family, or having friends abroad, or often just being in the wrong place at the wrong time, essentially. And devastatingly, this political fever infected workplaces and homes so that even friends and families turned upon each other. I arrived in China more than 30 years after it ended, and I assumed it was all over. I was wrong. In fact, a novelist told me that for her family, the movement had ended last April. That is, April 2012. Now, I wasn't sure at first if I'd misunderstood her, or vice versa. And then she explained. That was when her father had died, and she said that up until his last moments, he was still arguing with the Red Guards who had persecuted him decades before. He had never recovered from the breakdown he suffered in the Cultural Revolution. He'd been stuck in 1966. I'd read books about the Cultural Revolution, of course, but it was conversations like that one which made me realise how close it was and how potent it remained. In William Faulkner's famous words, "The past is not dead, it's not even past." Of course, we know that profound traumas can affect survivors decades later, but the individual psychological impact is really only a small part of the picture. Entrepreneurs would tell me how their drive to succeed was rooted in the precarity of the era. Filmmakers talked about how their dramatic vision had been shaped by growing up within an almost complete cultural vacuum as they hungered for glimpses of classical literature or foreign movies. And as Xi Jinping became China's leader and established his power, the movement's full impact on the country's politics became increasingly apparent, as I will discuss. And so my interest is not in history, but in China's present. I will examine what the Cultural Revolution was, and whether it was, in fact, a revolution, to explain how it is still shaping China to this day. Simply put, you cannot understand China without understanding the Cultural Revolution. It was the defining moment for modern China. Imagine trying to make sense of Britain without ever mentioning the empire, or talking about the US without discussing slavery or the Civil War. After it, the country flipped from socialist utopianism to capitalist frenzy and shifted from ruthless uniformity to pitiless individualism. The decade discredited Mao and Maoism so comprehensively that China embraced the market. And yet this time remains a highly and increasingly sensitive subject in China. A psychotherapist told me that in the aftermath, you might perhaps discuss it with a stranger that you met on the train, but you would never discuss it with someone closer to home. And many still won't talk about what they did or what was done to them, even within their families. Personal trauma, as well as official repression, has created a national amnesia. And while it's essential to understand the Cultural Revolution, it also feels in many ways impossible. It's confusing not only to outsiders like myself, or to young people who have a very dim awareness that something terrible happened in their family's past, but perhaps even more so for those who lived through it. Thanks to its contradictions and its scale and the sheer enormity of what happened, it can't be fathomed fully. You might have thought that fellow travellers would have found it more comprehensible, but in fact North Korean officials described it as a great madness, having nothing in common with either culture or a revolution. To many, it felt more like anarchy. It contained horrific violence with children beating to death their teachers and wanton destruction, as some of the country's greatest treasures were smashed or torched. And yet, alongside these terrible and tragic elements came aspects that were simply absurd. The venerations, for example, of mangoes that Mao had been given by Pakistan. These fruit were sent on ceremonial tours across the country and then immortalised in poems and on plates and bedsheets and all sorts of other paraphernalia. Or take the fact that for a brief time in Beijing, the Red Guards dictated that traffic police had to direct vehicles not with their usual batons, but with copies of the little red book of Chairman Mao's sayings, because only Chairman Mao thought could show you the correct way to proceed. And as trivial as those examples are, I think perhaps it helps to explain the image that people often have of the Cultural Revolution. The idea that it was just about young leftists being fanatical, or even as a personality that was a personality cult that was essentially kitsch and to be taken rather lightly. Incidentally, Simon Sharma remarked earlier in this series on how the word revolution had become almost meaningless in popular culture thanks to its embrace by marketing companies. I have to say, I think the phrase the Cultural Revolution has been still more abused. Yesterday, with a perfect timing, I received an email advertising London's Cultural Revolution. And I have to say that if your priority was rooting out bourgeois indulgence and capitalist tendencies, you probably wouldn't be promoting an immersive listening experience at Soho House. More disturbingly, Michael Gove, when Education Secretary, published an article suggesting that British universities needed a cultural revolution like the one they've had in China. Though possibly he did see the closure of institutions and the targeting of academics as a plus. But if you focus on the Maoist memorabilia, then it's easy to forget just how violent and extreme the Cultural Revolution was. This was an era which claimed the lives of both Mao Zedong's heirs apparent and many of the country's most revered figures. Revolutionaries who devoted their lives to the communist cause, leading scholars and artists and actors, and even its top table tennis star, who'd actually been a national hero for winning the first global sports competition for the country. But it didn't stop there, because so many were affected. Even infants in remote rural areas were murdered because their grandfather had been a landlord. In parts, the height of Maoism looks similar to the terrible genocides of the 20th century. But this was people killing their own kind, and the line between victims and perpetrators shifted moment by moment. So many people persecuted others, only to become targets themselves. In some regards, it echoes Stalinist purges, but with enthusiastic mass participation. And in many ways, it was the personal, intimate betrayals that were the most devastating. Friends turning upon each other, husband upon wife. Red Guards ran riot. The world was turned upside down. A civilization founded in large part on respect for learning and seniority, and which took immense pride in its history and culture, now encouraged children to defy their elders, valued zeal and emotion over thought, and sent teenagers out to destroy the old way of life. In place of the Confucian filial ideals which they'd been taught, children now learned to sing that mother and father are dear, but Chairman Mao is dearer. The man who first sang that song for me is now around 70, and he has spent his life coming to terms with his decision to denounce his mother for criticising Chairman Mao. He was just 17, and she was executed, and he was treated as a hero for his devotion to the cause, but he's had to live with it ever since. Because while some people have drawn parallels with the Lord of the Flies, this chaos and violence happened not only in the presence of adults, but at their instigation, specifically at Mao's. This was, at heart, about Mao's reassertion of political supremacy, and it began with his attempt to wipe out opposition within the party. He'd lost authority due to the disaster of the Great Leap Forward, his hubristic plan to revolutionise the country's industry and collectivise its agriculture. It led to the deaths of tens of millions in the Great Famine, and it had to be reined in by pragmatists within the party, like Deng Xiaoping, who would later become China's paramount leader. Mao was also looking to the Soviet Union, where Khrushchev had made a denunciation of Stalin and had then himself been removed. Now, purges were nothing new. They started essentially as soon as Mao took power in the Communist Party. But what was different in 1966 was that this time he went outside the party's structure. He whipped up mass sentiment and he turned it upon the party. And his troops, these political vigilantes, the Red Guards, were young, children in many cases, in their early teens. They'd been brought up to revere Chairman Mao, brought up to believe, not unreasonably at the time, that the country they loved, the People's Republic, was under threat, and brought up on ideals and stories of struggle and revolutionary violence for the communist cause and in the war against the brutal Japanese occupation. The population as a whole was traumatized by decades of invasion, war, and famine. And when you have an event on this scale, this kind of mass ideological crusade, it swiftly draws in not only political fanaticism, but also paranoia and personal grudges and all these other forces. People turned upon others to protect themselves. If someone was going to be persecuted, why should it be them? Or they acted in revenge because someone had targeted them or people that they loved. And petty motives, like ambition, even played a part, because if you brought down your boss, there would be a vacancy that you might perhaps fill. It all began with denunciations and then attacks by the Red Guards at the extreme, pupils torturing and murdering their teachers, but also cutting people's hair or slashing trousers that were too fashionable, raiding homes and confiscating silk clothing or family genealogies, even trampling gardens and confiscating fish bowls because flowers and pets were bourgeois. Relics were banned, artworks smashed, theatres closed, schools and universities shuttered. And then, as the movement spiralled, Red Guard groups began to split into factions and turn upon each other, often because of minute political disagreements as well as personal grievances or rivalries. A dispute over a political pamphlet could turn into something akin to civil war. In Chongqing, for example, tens of thousands of residents fled street battles. The city was home to munitions factories, and so the students fought each other not only with batons and bricks, but with grenades, machine guns, tanks, and even warships. Perhaps unsurprisingly, even Mao concluded that matters were getting out of hand. The Red Guards had served their purpose, and he used the army to rein them in. And what followed was then a period of more bureaucratic but still deadly persecution, in which constant waves of political campaigns and witch hunts meant that no one but Mao was ever truly safe. To give you an idea of the hysteria, officials pronounced that one of the most sinister aspects of a supposed conspiracy was that even its participants did not realize it existed. Sycophancy was essential, but even that was risky. People sometimes got in trouble for using the wrong characters when they were writing quotations from Mao. And if you were a senior leader, your only hope of advancement or even survival was to praise Mao lavishly. But that, of course, also made him suspicious that you might perhaps be a future threat because you were clearly someone with ambitions. While all this was going on, a pool of idle young people had been left in the cities with little to do. Schools were barely functioning, and the number of unemployed outstripped the jobs available. State media began to complain that young people were involved in hooliganism and, worse still, things that do not lead to socialism. So 17 million children and young people were sent off to labour in the countryside and were told they were going forever. Among them was Xi Jinping, now the country's leader, who spent 7 years in rural exile. It was a brutal and a lonely existence. Some of these kids had never spent a night away from home before. The villages were really a century behind the cities in terms of living standards, and conditions weren't only basic, but at times desperate. I mean, it was hard for even experienced farmers to scratch a living in many of these places. Some of these children never returned home, and few of them made it back before Mao's death and the overthrow of his wife, Jiang Qing, and the other zealots and opportunists who made up what would come to be known as the Gang of Four, who were key cheerleaders of the movement. Clearly, all of these events constitute a transformation of life in China. So is that enough to make it a revolution? Or was it solely the entrenchment of power by a man sometimes called China's last emperor, a ruthless suppression of rivals which then degenerated into general chaos? There's certainly no doubt that Mao embarked on all of this carefully and strategically and cynically. He was expert in laying traps for his political enemies. But his claim of a great cultural revolution was more than just camouflage. In fact, even as the party took power, Mao had warned that the sugar-coated bullets of the bourgeoisie might pierce the soul of communists. And 10 years before the Cultural Revolution, he said it might be necessary for the masses to take to the streets and implement great democracy, which didn't, of course, mean universal suffrage or elections. He believed his revolution had lost its way. He believed the party just didn't believe enough. It was being corrupted by power. In his view, a socialist society was generating a new exploiting class, cadres. And when the Great Leap Forward failed, He saw it primarily as a challenge to his personal power. But he also seems to have felt that it was a political failure in the broader sense. Maoism, of course, parted ways with orthodox Marxism in maintaining that you didn't need to wait for the correct economic and social conditions to arrive. It was a creed of belief and action. So if only you believed enough, if only you were bold enough, you could create the utopia. He described China as a blank sheet of paper on which one can paint the most beautiful picture. If it had gone wrong, then it must be the painters who were at fault. Months before his death, when he once again reigned supreme, he told a visitor that the Cultural Revolution was unfinished and insisted that it would and must be completed, if not in peace, then in turmoil. What about the participants? What did it mean for them? Well, strikingly, there is an immense amount of nostalgia and even fondness for the Cultural Revolution, despite all of its horrors. You can, for example, dine in Cultural Revolution restaurants where they play upbeat synth versions of The East is Red, and all the waitresses are dressed as Red Guards. In part, that just reflects the nostalgia that everybody feels for their youth, I think. And it's much easier to enjoy, of course, if your family didn't suffer. There are many survivors who regard these places as obscene. But like nostalgia anywhere, the warmth with which people view the past also speaks to their concerns about the present. Take the attitudes of the now pensioners who were sent to the countryside in their youth. They remember how bitter it was, but they still want to talk about it and to mark it. First of all, there were exhibitions and conventions, and then it became more commercialised. So there are now travel agencies that will arrange to take them on tours back to the villages where they once laboured. Guobin Yang has pointed out that this grassroots nostalgia movement emerged in the 90s, just as many of that generation were laid off in the mass sell-offs of state-owned enterprises. That didn't just leave them economically vulnerable, it also dismantled their sense of self, as they lost lifelong jobs, and the work units which had housed them and even approved their marriages just disappeared. They were looking for a sense of identity somewhere. For some, that meant religion or self-help guides, perhaps. But it isn't too hard to understand why, in an era of grotesque and surging inequality, where people seemed concerned with only making money and where corruption was both blatant and endemic, it isn't too hard to understand why they'd look back to the apogee of Maoism favourably. In contrast to the China before them, it looked like a time that was more egalitarian, when officials were kept in check and were serious about serving the people. And above all, it looked like a time of meaning and value, where not everything was reducible to material wealth and getting rich wasn't the only source of glory. The left critique of condemnation of the Cultural Revolution says essentially that the era's been traduced, because many of the people who suffered were the very people, political leaders and intellectuals, who benefited from privilege beforehand and who do most to shape our understanding of events. Why, for example, was it so horrifying for better-off urban youth to be subjected to the conditions that millions of farmers took for granted? The scholar Mobo Gao was himself put under house arrest and submitted to struggle sessions as a teenager in this time. Yet he argues that the party and elite intellectuals cannot speak on behalf of all Chinese, that the extent of violence has been exaggerated, that there were many constructive and creative developments during the Cultural Revolution that have been ignored or denigrated by the post-Cultural Revolution narrative. Now, I find Dr. Gao's reading to be far too generous to the movement, greatly overstating what it may have given people and understating the devastation it wrought and the way in which violent struggle was inherent in it. A former Red Guard said to me that looking for meaning or benefit in the movement was like trying to find the positive in Hitler, impossible and irrelevant. But it's easy to dismiss the value that some find in the Cultural Revolution without asking why they locate it there. These views often have at least a kernel of truth in them. Workers and farmers were given more respect. There were new paths to social mobility for a lucky few who used politics to catapult themselves from villages into life in the capital. Revolutionary culture was extremely restricted and looked stultifying even to people at the time. There was a joke that it was 800 million people watching 8 model operas. But these political works featured active female heroines. They fused classical and folk arts in radical new ways, and they were taken out to villages across the land, places that had never seen any culture of that kind. Dr. Gow argues that those years saw the creation of a new public sphere in the countryside, with an upsurge of cultural and sporting activities. And for many young people and workers, this seemed initially a time of liberation and dissent, however short-lived and marginal those tendencies proved to be, as I will discuss shortly. How, then, did all this shape the China of today? In some regards, the traces left by the movement reflect the fact that it was really an intensification of long-standing traits within the Chinese Communist Party. Long before the party took power, Mao had decreed that culture was a weapon and argued that art soldiers were a key part of the revolutionary struggle. And the Cultural Revolution really just exacerbated that. So while artists may complain about what they call cultural revolution tendencies, when you look at today's promotion and production of TV shows about great communist heroes, or the often petty controls we see on other works, such as banning time travel dramas for having an excessively trivial approach to history, then we should really see them as part of a longer-term communist tradition. But there are other regards in which that decade was particularly distinctive and formative. Consider the economy. The party continued to embrace Mao after his death. His giant portrait hangs on the red walls of Tiananmen in Beijing to this day, and his body still rests in a crystal sarcophagus at the heart of the city. But its embrace of the man allowed it to turn its back on Maoism, justify and driving the turn to the market. Why? Well, firstly, things were pretty bad economically. For the Communist Party, economics have always been trumped by politics, but in that era they came a very, very remote second. The opening stages of the Cultural Revolution were so disastrous that the economy actually shrank for the first couple of years. And while there was a recovery later on, partly because Deng Xiaoping and others were restored before being purged again, it was clear afterwards that a change was needed. Secondly, Maoism had been utterly discredited. The idea that the party served the people lay in shreds. So economic progress became a key source of legitimacy in its place. Thirdly, and somewhat counterintuitively, the Cultural Revolution actually proved a training ground for what followed. You had to be agile to grasp new opportunities and spot dangers in a constantly changing environment. And this individualistic struggle for survival, this sense of constant striving, really prepared survivors for life amid rapacious capitalism. In their book, Mao and Markets, Christopher Marcus, here at the Judge Business School, and his co-author, Kunyuan Xiao, quote a tycoon who said that the era taught his generation that you have to act like a wolf in order to survive. Take one of the unlikeliest heroes of the Cultural Revolution, a man called Zhang Tiesheng, but best known as the blank paper hero. At 22, struggling with the college entrance exam, and having answered only 3 questions, he had a flash of inspiration. I don't recommend this strategy for finals, by the way. Zhang wrote an angry letter to leaders on the back of his examination paper, excoriating the use of testing as a return to a capitalist model of education. He said that he'd been labouring hard in the fields for the good of the revolution, and that was what had stopped him from studying. So why should all these selfish bookworms, whose only interest was personal advancement, have the chance to get ahead instead of him? It was a masterstroke. He was quickly hailed by leaders up to and including Mao, and was granted a place at farming college. And that education paid off in every sense. By 2014, he was worth an estimated £18 million, thanks to his shareholdings in an animal feed and food processing company. If all of that still sounds a little nebulous to you, there are also some very specific, practical ways in which the era shaped China's economic trajectory. The encouragement of rural industry, though often pretty inefficient, did help lead to the development of township and village enterprises that were important to the reform and opening era. And the decision to encourage small-scale entrepreneurs was in part made because of the flood of young urbanites returning to the cities from that long forced exile in the countryside. There was suddenly a huge number of youths competing for a small number of state jobs, and most of the sent-down youth were undereducated and were now competing with younger and better-educated rivals. So allowing them to try their hand at selling noodles or fruit was really quite a practical way of solving that problem. The most profound effects of the Cultural Revolution, however, have been upon the country's politics. As I said, while for many this was a terrifying time, some found it initially liberating. In Chongqing, I spoke to former Red Guards who talked about it not only as a time of fanaticism, but also as a time of great democracy. On one estimate, 10,000 different pamphlets and newspapers were published in the era. Many differed only in the precise nature of their sycophancy towards Mao. But many of these were grassroots initiatives, and there was intensive discussion of political ideas, however small and abstruse those debates may have been. In The Cultural Revolution at the Margins, I Ching Wu shows how rebellion sometimes took on a life of its own, as long-standing grievances burst into what had been a tightly controlled political arena. The ambiguous and contradictory policies coming from the centre created space for debate and argument. Of course, it was never possible to challenge Mao. He was sacrosanct. But the fact that workers and pupils could challenge and bring down those who held power over them, however horrific their tactics at time, that was a revelation to them. Abusive officials faced accountability for the first time in many cases. And some workers and students offered a radical challenge to state socialism in the early years of the movement, although they often ended up paying dearly for it. Their demands ranged from better wages and conditions to challenges, to calling for the punishment of tyrannical cadres, or even rejecting the recentralization of power as the Cultural Revolution progressed. Despite the brutal curtailment of these possibilities, they lived on as a kind of memory. They induced a more critical attitude to authority, a sense that dissent was possible, which still, to some extent, persists to this day. You can trace its influence on the democracy wall movement, which sprang up in 1978 and had former Red Guards at its core. As the struggle for the ongoing control of the party went on, Deng Xiaoping hoped that encouraging people to put up posters with essays on them would help to discredit the Gang of Four and cement his position. But some began to go further, and one of them was Wei Jingsheng, who posted the most famous essay calling for political liberalization. He ended up spending 18 years in jail. He had been one of those sent to the countryside, and he had been shocked to learn from the peasants about the role that the party had played in the Great Famine. He realized it wasn't just a question of a natural disaster. And that encounter with the realities of how authoritarian political power shaped the lives of those at the very bottom convinced him of the need for change. Similar sentiments fed into the vast protests centred around Tiananmen Square in 1989, in which millions of Chinese people participated, not just students, but workers, judges, even police officers. Again, these were very different from the stirrings of the Cultural Revolution. They were peaceful demonstrations, not violent attacks. But that spirit of challenging authority and of debating openly endured. And arguably, we can see some of the same forces at play more recently in the actions of grassroots lawyers or the activism of neo-Maoist students who've sought to support factory labourers. Even though each time these flowerings have been so ruthlessly suppressed, their emergence owes something to that era. How did it shape the leadership's thinking? Well, in the wake of the disaster following Mao's death and the ousting of the Gang of Four, senior leaders who'd survived the purging returned to power. And Deng Xiaoping and other party elders who were rehabilitated passed an official verdict on the movement. History's always been a tool or a weapon in China, rather than a record of events, let alone an abstract discussion. And that's been particularly the case under the Communist Party. So the purpose was not to memorialise and record what had happened, but, as Deng told the drafters, to unite people and to look ahead. And the official verdict was that the movement was a catastrophe and Mao had been labouring under a misapprehension. Its purpose was threefold. It explained the rehabilitation of these leaders who'd been excoriated in the previous decade. It justified the dramatic turn away from communism towards the market. And perhaps most importantly, it allowed those at the top to portray themselves as the guarantors of stability and the Communist Party as the key defence against chaos. Essentially, the message is that you can have us or you can have anarchy. And so perversely, an era when the world turned upside down has become an essential part of the party state's maintenance of the political status quo. Of course, it was the party which inflicted the Cultural Revolution upon the nation in the first place. But it still succeeded in using the movement as a very effective bogeyman, and a very efficient one, because the party can repurpose it for pretty much any situation. Anything other than the status quo, whether it be to the left or to the right, will count as a potential rerun. So when Bo Xilai, the quasi-Maoist leader in Chongqing, was brought down in a political scandal in 2012, comparisons were drawn between his leadership and the Cultural Revolution. But they were also made when pro-democracy protesters took to the streets in Hong Kong. And the Cultural Revolution is all the more sinister and potent because it dwells in the shadows. The party's made sure that no one sheds too much light on it. At first, there was an outpouring of what was known as scar literature, these wrenching accounts of the decade's suffering. But gradually, from the early 80s, these kinds of stories and books began to be targeted. And by 2012, not long after coming to power, Xi would announce that what he called historical nihilism was an existential threat to the party, on a par with Western democracy. Historical nihilism includes, for example, suggesting that there was a decisive change of direction at the end of the Cultural Revolution. You may remember the old Soviet joke that under communism, the future is certain. It's the past which is always unpredictable. While underground historians continue to do striking and important work in China, these controls on information, on memory, have ensured that most people have only a very hazy conception of the era. Many of those who lived through it still blame the Gang of Four or the recklessness of youth. And so while there was huge popular support for the 1989 demonstrations, a significant number of people responded to that sight of them all in Tiananmen Square as intrinsically dangerous. As I've said, they were radically different to the fanatical political rallies of Red Guards which had gathered to worship Mao in the same square. But it's not hard to understand why leaders who had suffered so greatly, whose children had been severely injured, whose wives had died, who'd endured years of persecution, might see the sight of young people massing there as a threat to not only their political but even their physical survival. That surely played some part in the ruthless, bloody suppression which saw hundreds of protesters and their supporters killed. The second key decision made by party elders was to prevent a strongman ever taking hold again. They had a very personal stake in doing so, of course. Among them was Xi Zhongxun, a revered revolutionary who'd been terribly abused and who, incidentally, was the father of China's current leader, Xi Jinping. Xi the elder and his peers sought to cage the power of individuals within the party. They tried to put up guardrails and create collective decision-making. They established norms around term limits and retirement ages. And yet Xi's son, Xi Jinping, has swept all this away since taking power in 2012. It's important to remember that he suffered too. His half-sister is believed to have killed herself because of the pressure the family was under. Friends say that Xi's own mother was made to denounce him at a rally. And things were so bad that he once reminisced about how he'd laughed on the train to the countryside as all the other children wept around him. Because however grim it was going to be, he thought it had to be a better and a safer bet than staying in the capital. But he seems to have taken away a very different lesson from all of this than his father did. He seems to believe that instead of caging power, you need to ensure that you monopolize it. He is China's most powerful leader since Mao, and he is there indefinitely. He's scrapped term limits. Normally, he would have stepped down in 2022 after 10 years. There's no sign of a successor waiting in the wings, as was previously the norm. And the position of Premier, the second in command, has been very evidently downgraded. There's a burgeoning personality cult. He's even been hailed as a helmsman in reference to the term once used of Mao. Of course, we don't see the obsessive, quasi-religious veneration that Mao was accorded, or the harsh penalties for infringements, but nonetheless, the echoes are striking. A propaganda video from an elementary school shows children singing, "Grandpa Xi is our great friend," and waving sunflowers in honor of a smile they call warmer than the sun. Just as Chinese citizens were once compared to sunflowers turning towards the red sun in our hearts. There's no little red book, but there is a little red app for studying, Xi Jinping thought. We also see increasing suspicion of and hostility towards the outside world. I knew things were starting to change when I asked a market trader in a small town about the price of cabbages, and she replied, "If we tell you, we will be like foreign spies." Parents who would once have boasted of their children working for foreign companies now grumble that they should be working for Chinese enterprises. Undergraduates report on their teachers. A leading expert on the Cultural Revolution found her office plastered with denunciations reminiscent of the big character posters which covered campuses in 1966. The once mighty tech giants have been reined in, and investment bankers are studying Xi Jinping thought. We see the party promoting patriarchal ideals as it worries about a falling birth rate and cracking down on LGBTQ rights. It's tightened its grip on religion, and the most striking parallels exist in Xinjiang, where Human Rights Watch has written of abuses of a scope and scale not seen in China since the Cultural Revolution. Just as minorities suffered disproportionately in the 60s and 70s, so Uyghur Muslims are targeted now. An estimated 1 million people have been sent to detention camps, what Beijing calls re-education centres, for having relatives abroad or perhaps reciting verses from the Quran, the kinds of offences that might well have made you a target in the Cultural Revolution. And when the pandemic struck, many in China were horrified by what felt like a return to an earlier era, with authorities dragging people from their home and neighbours reporting on each other. In many ways, I'm struck by the divergences as much as the parallels. It's impossible to imagine Xi relishing disruption and disorder in the way that Mao once did. Xi was a provincial official in 1989, and just before the protests were suppressed, he said to his underlings, "Wasn't the Cultural Revolution the manifestation of big democracy? It's not in accordance with science or the rule of law, but in accordance with superstition, stupidity, and the result is major chaos." So Xi works through party structures, reaching people through the system instead of calling on them to upend it. In this regard, Donald Trump is actually a more Maoist figure, whipping up mass emotion and turning it against political institutions, though that's clearly not a comparison which either the Communist Party or the Republicans would relish. But many in China now seem to hear the echoes of the Cultural Revolution. One of the most courageous critics, the scholar Xu Zhangrun, has written that we need to ask how a vast country like China, so ruinously served by a personality cult before, has no resistance to this new cult. And these complaints aren't restricted to rarefied intellectual circles. When there were rare protests at the end of 2022 against the draconian zero COVID policies, people held up signs saying, "Reform, not the Cultural Revolution." Even the most fearful acknowledged that it couldn't happen again in exactly the form it did. It was the product of a very specific time, place, and set of circumstances. People in China are more educated, more connected to the outside world, and fundamentally more cynical, thanks in large part to what they witnessed in that era. Xu Youyu suggests that back then, Mao Zedong was one brain controlling 800 million people, while now at least half have their own minds. And there is another difference now. The Chinese researchers who have tirelessly, and often at personal risk, attempted to recover and record what happened. Xi's relentless drive to eradicate historical nihilism has suppressed much of the informal discussion that was emerging when I was based in Beijing, and large swathes of the archives are now off limits to foreign researchers. The sociologist Michel Bonin has compared unofficial memory in China to an archipelago whose little islands are threatened by the vast surrounding ocean of official oblivion. But one thing that political control and censorship tend to inculcate is, perversely, ingenuity, finding ways to work in the limited spaces or preserving evidence for someone to later recover. The struggle for memory is one of the key reasons why the Cultural Revolution was not only so devastating, but to this day so formative. Despite the fact that its death toll, however vast, was relatively modest compared to other horrors of that era. The Cultural Revolution was universal. It stretched through every strata of society and to every part of the country. No one was untouched. And secondly, it was precisely the fact that Chinese people had already endured so much that made it devastating. It was the culmination of a series of tragedies, and this one was created by the promise of a better future and by your neighbours rather than by foreign aggression. Thirdly, its renunciation was itself a form of trauma. Even some of the movement's victims had found a way to live with their suffering by blaming themselves. They concluded that they had not been good enough communists or perhaps had not adequately considered their bourgeois privilege. And to then learn that the movement had in fact been down to a misapprehension, in official terms, was a fresh devastation. It turned out that all they had endured had been for nothing, and the turn to rapacious capitalism only reinforced this sense of meaninglessness. And that takes me to the final and perhaps most significant factor. There has been no adequate reckoning with this era. The official verdict, the flood of scar literature, the show trial of Mao's wife Jiang Qing and the Gang of Four offered only the briefest sense of catharsis, or in some cases, revenge. But this was an era in which everyone was involved, almost everyone was complicit to some degree, and yet there's been no collective discussion of this collective disaster. Instead, people have remained living in silence alongside those who betrayed them or their loved ones. My time in China coincided with a brief blossoming of memory. Red Guards began to come forward to discuss not only what had been done to them, but what they had done to others. Some apologised to their victims. But these discussions were soon shut down as the party increased its grip on history. Many of the early Red Guards came from powerful political families, so the party didn't really want to see their crimes exposed. And the party couldn't afford a real account of Mao's role in this affair. People often say that it's because he's China's Lenin and Stalin all rolled into one. You can't say it started off really well and then the other guy came along and ruined it. If you discredit Mao, you discredit the whole revolution. I actually think it's more fundamental than that. If you allow people to condemn former leaders, then why can't they do the same for you? And while political survival is the central impetus, I do think they have concerns about social cohesion. Several former Red Guards told me that they'd love to see truth and reconciliation commissions like those of South Africa. And yet even they often found it hard to talk to each other. I'd initially anticipated discovering a community of truth-telling brothers in arms, but what I found was something more fractured and even fractious. It wasn't just that some thought the movement was utterly irredeemable, while others thought the Cultural Revolution could have worked if it had been given a better chance. It was that even people who broadly shared a political perspective would furiously denigrate each other for being too tough or not harsh enough on those who'd committed crimes in the era. They'd end up accusing each other of showing a Red Guard mentality and of making ad hominem attacks on each other. So it's true that opening up this subject isn't easy, but shutting it down has only allowed it to fester. Lu Xun, one of China's most revered authors, wrote, "Lies written in ink cannot cover up facts written in blood. Blood debts must be repaid in kind, and the longer the delay, the greater the interest." He was writing 40 years before the Cultural Revolution broke out, but his words still resonate. Psychotherapists told me that not only survivors, but their children too, are paying through what's known as transgenerational trauma. Research into the phenomenon originated with the children of Holocaust survivors who'd often been deeply affected, even or perhaps especially when their parents never spoke about what had happened. It's hard to instill the confidence your children need to understand and navigate the world when you've learned in the most visceral way that the world is not safe and that it makes no sense. Humans can be remarkably resilient. Many of those I met have overcome their pasts to form loving relationships, rear happy children, reach out compassionately to others, even forgive their persecutors. But almost half a century after the Cultural Revolution ended, China is still fundamentally scarred by that decade. And I believe that the era will continue to shape the country until it can be fully faced and openly discussed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tania, for delivering a powerful, evocative, thoughtful and thought-provoking finale to our Darwin College lecture series on revolutions. I think your insights on the impact of what was only a 10-year political, cultural, social revolution, the impact that can have on a country, its people, and indeed the role China plays now, almost 50 years later, is quite extraordinary and profound. A salutary lesson, a thorough analysis, which we just have to hope will inform others, other nations, other political leaders going forward in the future. But thank you very much. That really was splendid. This is, of course, our last Darwin lecture in the Revolution series. And over the last 8 weeks, we've had a rich, varied, scholarly mix of perspectives on revolutions in astronomy, history, philosophy, politics, genetics, evolution, the functioning of the brain, and in art. We've seen a balance between those who've highlighted that revolutions can be dangerous, disastrous, disruptive, destabilizing, with others who've demonstrated that actually revolutions can be exciting and provide an opportunity of change for the benefit of society and all of us. Given the fact that we have more than 2 billion people voting in 64 different national elections this year, surely this is a time when revolutionary ideas and actions to address the global challenges we all know about and capitalize on the exciting opportunities that we have must be addressed and taken forward, recognizing and being very mindful of what we have just heard today. I believe the topic of revolutions has actually been quite revolutionary for Darwin College. We've had a record attendance of lectures in person, and I'm delighted to say we've had already over 100,000 hits on our YouTube channel, as of today, I gather. We wanted a big, eye-catching topic for our 60th anniversary, and I certainly think we have had one. I hope this is a taste of things to come for the next 60 years of Darwin College's contribution to nurturing and promoting scholarship, education, and research. That's what we are here for. So, where do we go next? Well, it's 2025, Darwin College Lecture Series coming up, and I'm delighted to reveal that the topic will be codes. So as you can see, we've got a broad diversity of disciplines, from maths to music, genetics to women's knowledge, languages to computer coding, and a range of outstanding speakers, as you can also see, who will explore this fascinating topic and fast-moving theme. While you just take a moment to absorb that list of speakers and decide that you want to attend all of them, let me just say a few words of concluding thanks to people without whom we would not be here. First of all, the custodians in Lady Mitchell Hall, and for our 2 overflow lecture theatres that have been well populated this year. We are very grateful to you for everything that you have done. And similarly, our IT, AV, alumni relations and communications teams, both in Darwin College but also in the university, who've ensured that by and large this has all run very smoothly. Our ushers have done a wonderful job under Tim Milner's leadership, who sadly is not with us this evening, but we've had a team of postdoctoral fellows and associates, students and official fellows of the college who've managed by and large to corral you all into at least one of the 3 lecture theatres. And thank you for moving up. I know that's always a difficult thing to do, but it's really important to get people in. I'd also like to thank our Education and Research Committee members, especially the chair, for the support that they give throughout the year to enabling us to organise and run these lectures. And I'd also like to thank Cambridge University Press, who've been publishing the essays that come from these lectures for a number of years for us, and we are just renewing a contract with them to publish for the next 5 years, including gold open access, so that will make them much more accessible globally, we hope. And almost last, but certainly not least, can you join me in saying a very enormous thank you to the 2 organisers of this year's lecture series, John Nielsen Wright, an associate professor in modern Japanese politics and international relations, and Dr. Alwyn Scally, an associate professor in genetics. It was their idea. They drove it hard through the college. They found some wonderful speakers and supported them throughout. So thank you both very much indeed. And of course, as you know, I believe since 2007, one person, namely our college registrar, Janet Gibson, has been in touch with all of you and everybody else for the last however many years to make sure that you can attend, to make sure that we make these things happen. And without you, Janet, we simply wouldn't be here and it wouldn't be happening. So thank you. So finally, do join me in saying an enormous thank you again to Tania for her lecture, rounding off this series. It's been wonderful. We've thoroughly enjoyed it, despite, it was extremely thought-provoking, extremely challenging, and very, very rich in lessons and thought and analysis. So thank you very much indeed, Tania. Just before you all go for another year, I must say personally a very heartfelt appreciation from me and from the college to you, our audience. We organise these lectures for you. We've done so for the last 39 years. Do come back and join us in 2025 for our 40th of the Darwin College Lectures. Thank you very much and good night.